Or directly, you might simply starve to death because your partner, the designated hunter, was terrible at their job. Grog hasn't brought back anything but a single, suspiciously small lizard in 3 days. And sustenance. There was no formal ending to the relationship. It simply dissolved into the harsh reality of resource scarcity. Your partner's failure wasn't a personal flaw. It was a threat to your very existence. The ultimate romantic gesture wasn't a bouquet of flowers. It was sharing the choicest cut of meat. It wasn't a love letter. It was demonstrating that you knew where the safest water source was. It wasn't a promise of forever. It was the implicit understanding that you would both try your absolute best to survive another day together. And if one of you failed, the other would, out of necessity, move on quickly, because sentimentality doesn't feed hungry children, and a broken heart heals faster when you're not also suffering from rampant malnutrition. So, next time your partner forgets to pick up milk, just remember, at least they didn't single-handedly cause your starvation. You could probably survive without that milk. Your prehistoric self? Not so much. All right, let's talk about the original source of relationship drama, the family. Specifically, the prehistoric family and tribal unit, which had a rather, shall we say, proactive approach to your romantic future. Forget love matches based on shared interests or a spark of emotional connection. In prehistory, your parents and elders weren't just nudging you towards someone suitable. They were orchestrating alliances, forging peace treaties, and occasionally straight up acquiring spouses through methods that would make modern HR departments spontaneously combust. Marriages, if they even existed as a formal concept beyond these two fertile individuals are now living together, were often strategic alliances between families or entire tribes. It wasn't about whether you thought your partner was cute. It was about securing access to better hunting grounds, gaining extra hands for defense, or cementing a fragile peace. Yes, young Thag, we know you have eyes for the graceful girl from the River Clan. But, unfortunately, your betrothed is the eldest daughter of the Mountain Clan chieftain, whose tribe controls all the good flint deposits. So, you'll be marrying her. And, yes, she has a beard. Deal with it. For the flint. Your personal feelings were, to put it mildly, irrelevant. The survival and prosperity of the group trumped any nascent romantic stirrings you might have had. You were a pawn in a much larger, much more brutal game of tribal geopolitics. And then there's the delightful phenomenon of bride abduction, a disturbingly common courtship method particularly prevalent in early pastoral and agricultural societies. Consent? That's a concept that wouldn't even begin to form in the human brain for another few tens of thousands of years, after we'd figured out things like writing and not constantly dying of preventable diseases. In many cases, if a tribe wanted a woman from another group, they simply took her, often forcefully, often violently. It was less a marriage proposal and more a territorial raid with a reproductive bonus. Imagine your modern dating app experience. You swipe right, and suddenly you're unconscious and being dragged back to a stranger's cave. Talk about a surprise first date. This wasn't romance. It was a brutal, non-consensual transaction of genetic material and labor. These decisions were driven by intensely practical needs, not romantic notions. Does this person have strong genes? Do they have a good track record of survival? Are they from a tribe that we really don't want to fight right now? These were the considerations. Your parents weren't worried about whether you felt seen or understood by your partner. They were worried about whether your partner could successfully chew leather into pliable clothing, or, more critically, club a charging bear into submission. These were the essential skills for a good spouse. Emotional compatibility was a distant, unreachable star. Practical utility was the sun around which your entire life revolved. The dark humor here is palpable. Imagine your parents, in their sagely wisdom, explaining their choice for your life partner. Yes, son, we know you wanted the one with the slightly less prominent brow ridge, but this one can chew through a deer hide in under an hour without losing a single tooth. And her father has a really big spear. It's for the best, believe me. Or, daughter, this mate we've chosen for you is excellent at spotting edible fungi from a great distance. And while he smells vaguely of old fish, his sister is very good at weaving baskets. It's an excellent family alliance. These weren't just practical decisions, they were life or death negotiations disguised as familial blessings. So, the next time your family asks if you're seeing anyone, and you feel that familiar pang of modern societal pressure, just remember that at least they're not arranging your abduction or forcing you into a loveless union for the sole purpose of securing better access to obsidian. You've got it pretty good, comparatively speaking. All right, let's hit the fast forward button again, a significant leap this time. We're moving into the Neolithic Revolution, roughly 10,000 BCE onwards. This wasn't just a minor tweak. This was a complete seismic shift in human existence, the invention of agriculture. We stopped chasing our food and started growing it. And while that sounds like a grand step forward for civilization, it was an absolute game changer for relationships, introducing a whole new bouquet of dating-related miseries. We went from nomadic nuisances to settled strife, and it only got more complicated. Sedentary life led to new problems and, naturally, new relationship problems. Suddenly, we had property. We had fields. We had stored grain. We had permanent dwellings. And with property came the concept of inheritance. Who gets what when old Thag finally succumbs to a rogue turnip? This wasn't an issue when all your possessions could be carried on your back or shoved into a temporary shelter. Now, with fixed assets, relationships became inextricably linked to material wealth. Who you married could literally determine your access to fertile land, your share of the harvest, or the sturdy walls of a permanent mud brick house. It was the original gold digger scenario, only with less gold and more, well, dirt. Increased population density was another charming side effect. Instead of small, scattered bands wandering across vast plains, we started huddling together in villages. More people, more potential mates, right? Theoretically. But also more competition, more disease, and far more complex social dynamics. Suddenly, your romantic options were no longer limited to the 20 people in your immediate nomadic group. Now, you had hundreds, perhaps thousands, in a growing village or early town. This meant more chances to find someone who wasn't your cousin, a definite upgrade, but also more chances for rejection, for rivalries, for jealousy, and for navigating an increasingly intricate web of social expectations and hierarchies. The intimacy of the small band was replaced by the uncomfortable proximity of hundreds of strangers, all vying for resources and, inevitably, partners. The shift from nomadic, fluid relationships to more fixed, territorial pairings was profound. When you're constantly on the move, relationships can be, by necessity, somewhat transient. People come and go, often literally, as in they die or wander off. But when you're tied to a piece of land, when your entire livelihood depends on that specific patch of earth, your relationships become similarly rooted. You couldn't just pack up your animal skins and migrate away from a bad marriage. Your entire life was now here, tied to the soil. Divorce, if it even existed, became infinitely more complicated. Divorce, if it even existed, became infinitely more complicated. Splitting up didn't just mean going your separate ways. It meant unraveling a complex web of land ownership, shared labor, and social standing within a community that now had very long memories. And then came the invention of land ownership, which, in a darkly comedic twist, often made people part of the deal, often literally. A woman might be married off as part of a land exchange. A family might trade a daughter for access to better grazing lands. You weren't just getting a spouse. You were acquiring an asset that came with a claim to resources, or providing one to another family. The concept of "you're marrying into our family" evolved from a pleasant sentiment to a hard economic reality. Your romantic life was no longer just about you. It was about the acreage, the livestock, the granary. It was about the cold, hard calculus of resource management. So the next time you're worried about whether your potential partner owns a house, just remember that your ancestors were literally buying and selling people to secure property. Makes a mortgage seem downright romantic, doesn't it? With the Neolithic Revolution came the glorious, tragic, and utterly defining emergence of patriarchy. As agriculture took root and settled life became the norm, something profoundly shifted in the delicate balance of gender roles. Women, who in many hunter-gatherer societies might have held more egalitarian roles due to their crucial contributions to foraging and child-rearing, slowly but surely transitioned from partners in survival to possessions. The concept of wives as property, as valuable assets, began its long, inglorious reign. Women became primarily valued for two things: their reproductive capabilities and their labor. As society transitioned from small, mobile bands to larger agricultural settlements, the need for hands in the fields, for processing crops, and, crucially, for producing more children to work those fields, grew exponentially. A woman wasn't just a fellow human. She was a walking, talking, highly valuable baby factory and field hand. Her worth became increasingly tied to her ability to produce sons, to inherit land and perpetuate the family name, and to contribute to the economic output of the household. It wasn't about her intelligence, her spirit, or her dreams. It was about her uterus and her muscles. This shift manifested most brutally in the emergence of dowries and bride prices. Forget the quaint idea of an engagement ring. We're talking about explicit transactions, where women were valued as commodities in tribal exchanges. A bride price was paid by the groom's family to the bride's family, compensating them for the loss of her labor and reproductive potential. A dowry, conversely, was property or money brought by the bride to her new husband, essentially a payment for taking her on, or a contribution to the new household. Either way, the message was clear. A woman's value was quantifiable, transactional, and negotiable, like a particularly fertile livestock animal. Your entrance into marriage was not a declaration of love. It was a contract of exchange, often involving goats. And because lineage became paramount, who owns the land, who inherits the fields, who continues the family name, there was an increased, often brutal, control over female sexuality. Ensuring paternity was crucial for property rights. This led to strict rules about chastity, virginity, and fidelity for women, enforced with extreme prejudice. Men, meanwhile, often enjoyed far greater sexual freedom. The idea was to ensure that the children born into a household were definitively the husband's, securing his legacy and land rights. Women's bodies became battlegrounds for control and lineage. Their autonomy eroded in the service of patrilineal inheritance. The romantic notion of my body, my choice was light years away. It was my body, the tribe's necessity, my husband's property. The bleak reality, then, was that marriage often evolved into an economic and social transaction. Emotional connection became at best a pleasant but utterly unnecessary bonus. If you happened to find a deep bond with the person you were married off to, congratulations, you hit the prehistoric jackpot. But more often than not, it was a practical arrangement. You provide children and labor, I provide protection and sustenance, and together we work this patch of dirt until we both die prematurely from a fungal infection. It was a merger and acquisition, not a love story. So the next time you're celebrating an anniversary or exchanging heartfelt vows, take a moment to truly appreciate the luxury of romantic love. Because for our ancestors, the closest thing to a wedding toast might have been a solemn declaration about the fertility of the soil and the strength of the new bride's back. Cheers to that, I suppose. All right, let's inject a delightful dose of existential dread into our already bleak romantic landscape. Because in prehistoric times, even if you somehow managed to navigate the grunting, the stench, the lack of privacy, and the forced alliances, you were still playing a terrifying game of Russian roulette with something far more insidious than a bad personality: disease and death. These were the ultimate buzzkills, ensuring that any nascent spark of connection was always under the shadow of imminent, often agonizing oblivion. Imagine finding someone who, against all odds, you don't actively hate. Someone whose grunts are less grating, whose ability to club a wild boar fills you with a strange sense of comfort. You might even be starting to form a rudimentary bond, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of constant survival. And then, next week, they're gone. Not ghosted gone, but actually gone. A common cold, an utterly trivial sniffle by modern standards, could mutate into a deadly pneumonia. A minor cut from a flint tool could fester into a raging infection, leading to sepsis and a swift, miserable end. Dysentery. A parasitic worm. A fungal infection from a damp cave. Any one of 1,000 unseen horrors could snatch your soulmate away, leaving you alone again, wondering if it was even worth bothering to form a connection in the first place. The emotional toll of constantly losing partners and children must have been immense, yet normalized to the point of numbness. How do you form deep, lasting bonds? How do you allow yourself to truly love when everyone around you is so painfully, terrifyingly fragile? When infant mortality rates were astronomically high, often half of all children not surviving to adulthood, you learned early on that attachment was a luxury you could rarely afford. Every birth was a gamble, every fleeting moment of health a temporary reprieve. A bond was less a promise of forever and more a whispered prayer against the inevitable. It was a world where grief was a constant companion, an echo in every silent cave, a shadow lurking behind every successful hunt. And that classic wedding vow, "Till death do us part," oh, it came much, much sooner than expected. And it wasn't usually a peaceful, dignified passing in a warm bed surrounded by loved ones. No, death often meant a swift, brutal end from a predator, a fall down a ravine, a tribal skirmish, or a slow, agonizing demise from an untreated infection or disease. Your partner wasn't just parting from you, they were decomposing next to you, or being dragged off by scavengers, or perhaps buried quickly and shallowly before the rest of the tribe had to move on. It was a constant, stark reminder of humanity's precarious place in the food chain and at the mercy of the elements. So, here's a truly sarcastic comparison to your modern commitment issues. At least your modern date won't die of dysentery before dessert, or spontaneously combust from a raging fever, or get dragged off by a cave bear while you're momentarily distracted by a particularly shiny pebble. Your worries about whether they'll reply to your text or if they're the one seem utterly quaint in comparison to the looming, ever-present specter of total annihilation. Next time you're having a deep, philosophical conversation with your partner or simply enjoying their company, remember that every single second of that connection was an improbable victory against a world actively trying to tear you both apart. Now, doesn't that make things just a little bit more romantic? No? Yeah, probably not. All right, let's talk about the timeless tradition of relationship drama. Because even in the primordial soup of prehistory, human emotions, particularly the ugly ones, found a way to manifest. Forget your passive-aggressive social media posts or your whispered complaints to your therapist. In a world devoid of counseling, legal systems, or even the concept of boundaries, dispute resolution often involved violence, banishment, or brutal tribal intervention. Jealousy, infidelity, and retribution were raw, visceral, and had immediate, often deadly consequences. There were no therapists in the Paleolithic, no relationship counselors guiding you through active listening exercises. If you had a grievance with your partner, if you suspected infidelity, or if someone else was making eyes at your designated mate, you didn't schedule a couples session. You might, instead, engage in a very direct, very physical confrontation. Resolution often meant a bruised ego, a broken bone, or, if things really escalated, a fatal encounter. Banishment from the tribe was another delightful option, a social death sentence that usually led to a literal one. Imagine your partner cheating, and instead of a messy divorce, they're simply exiled to the wilderness, left to face the saber-toothed tigers alone. That's one way to enforce monogamy, I suppose. Infidelity was, as you might imagine, a serious breach, often met with brutal physical retribution. And here's where the dawn of patriarchy really dug its heels in. This retribution was disproportionately and savagely directed against women. While men might have engaged in infidelity with fewer consequences, a woman's transgression was seen as a direct threat to paternity, lineage, and the very fabric of tribal order. It could lead to severe beatings, mutilation, or even death. Her betrayal wasn't just a personal slight. It was an act against the entire male-dominated structure. So no, there were no open relationships or ethical non-monogamies being explored in the prehistoric cave. Just a very clear, very violent code of conduct. The concept of ownership extended far beyond land and resources. It very much extended to partners. A male perceived his mate as his, a valuable asset, a reproducer of his lineage. This led to fierce territoriality. If another male so much as looked cross-eyed at your partner, it could be seen as an act of aggression, a challenge to your status, and a direct threat to your genetic future. And challenges in prehistory were rarely settled with a polite debate. They were settled with clubs, stones, and a primal scream. The drama wasn't about who left the toilet seat up. It was about who was claiming reproductive rights to whom. And the consequences for getting that wrong could be immediate and fatal. And here's the dark humor in dealing with a love triangle when the only mediator is a very angry chief with a spear. Imagine two cavemen, both grunting aggressively over the affections of a single woman. Instead of a heart-to-heart, they're preparing to beat each other senseless. The chief, observing this potential disruption to tribal harmony, doesn't suggest a compromise. He doesn't offer counseling. He simply points his spear at the least useful or most disruptive of the two, making it very clear who wins or who gets to live. You, he grunts, indicating the less favored suitor, go hunt or die, your choice. Or, perhaps more chillingly, she is for him. You touch her, I will put this spear through you. A very decisive, if somewhat brutal, resolution, I think you'll agree. So next time you're navigating the complexities of modern dating jealousy, remember that at least your rival isn't likely to be banished to the wilderness or face a very pointy tribal intervention. You're welcome for that small comfort. All right. Let's tackle another delightful layer of prehistoric dating woe, the utter, soul-crushing inadequacy of communication. We've talked about the stench, the danger, the lack of privacy, but imagine trying to navigate a relationship when your language skills are roughly on par with a very articulate chimpanzee. Trying to convey, I love you, or I'm upset about your habit of leaving mammoth bones everywhere. That, my friends, was the ultimate frustration. Consider the profound challenge of expressing complex emotions. How do you articulate the tender stirrings of affection, the subtle nuances of disappointment, or the intricate landscape of your inner emotional world when your toolkit consists of, say, 50 different grunts? A low growl might mean, I'm hungry, but it might also mean, I'm mildly annoyed by your lack of contribution to the foraging effort, or I find you marginally attractive in a purely reproductive sense. The meaning was often context. Misunderstandings, therefore, were rampant. And not just the kind of benign misunderstandings that lead to awkward silences on a modern first date. These misunderstandings could have serious, life-threatening consequences. Imagine you're trying to warn your partner about a predatory animal lurking near the water source. You grunt, you point, you make a clawing motion. But they interpret it as, hey, there's a really good fishing spot over there, let's go. And off they trot, directly into the jaws of a waiting saber-tooth. Your inability to articulate clearly didn't just hurt feelings. It could literally get someone killed. The stakes for miscommunication were astronomically high, turning every conversation into a linguistic minefield. The frustration of wanting to express deep feelings, but only having sounds and gestures at your disposal must have been immense. Perhaps you felt a profound, wordless connection with your mate, a shared understanding forged in the fires of mutual survival. You wanted to articulate the depth of your bond, the fear of losing them, the simple comfort of their presence, but all you could manage was a slightly more tender grunt, a perhaps less aggressive shove, a shared gaze that spoke volumes, volumes that could easily be misinterpreted as a desperate need for fire-starting assistance. The poets of prehistory were by necessity masters of mime and primal vocalizations, and probably still felt profoundly unheard. And so we arrive at the ultimate prehistoric "it's not you, it's me" scenario. Except in this case, it was "it's not you, it's me," and my inability to form complex, nuanced sentences about my emotional state. How do you break up with someone, or even just express dissatisfaction, when the very act of trying to explain yourself is a monumental linguistic struggle? You don't have the words for "we're just on different paths" or "I need space to grow." You have a series of increasingly agitated grunts, perhaps a frustrated headshake, and then you probably just wander off to another cave. The very foundation of emotional intimacy, open, honest, verbal communication, was an evolutionary cul-de-sac that humanity hadn't even begun to explore. So the next time you're agonizing over writing the perfect text message or trying to articulate your feelings in a difficult conversation, just remember, at least you have words. Glorious, complex, nuanced words. Use them, or don't, but at least you have the option. All right, let's talk about the biological inevitability of prehistoric passion. And by passion, I mean the desperate biological imperative to procreate. Because in this era, every single date, every moment of physical intimacy had the very real, very high-stakes potential of leading to another tiny human, a human who would need to be fed, clothed, protected, and kept alive in absolutely incredibly harsh, unforgiving conditions. Forget hook-up culture with its myriad birth control options. Prehistoric people were playing extreme biological roulette, often with dire consequences. The constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth was, for women, an immense physical toll, a relentless biological burden that often led to early death. From the moment of puberty until menopause, if they even lived that long, women were almost constantly either pregnant, breastfeeding, or recovering from childbirth. Each pregnancy was a life-threatening ordeal, often without privacy, hygiene, or any medical assistance beyond a few sympathetic grunts. Imagine giving birth in a damp, smoky cave, surrounded by curious tribe members, with no pain relief, no antiseptic, and the very real risk of hemorrhaging to death or dying from infection. And then, a few months later, you're probably pregnant again. This wasn't just a challenge. It was a gauntlet that women ran repeatedly until their bodies simply gave out. The overwhelming burden of child rearing in prehistory is almost impossible to comprehend from our modern vantage point. No formula, no disposable diapers, no daycare, no pediatricians, no vaccines. Every child was a tiny, incredibly vulnerable, high-maintenance project. You carried them with you during nomadic migrations, strapped to your back while foraging. You nursed them constantly. You protected them from predators, disease, and accidental falls. You tried to keep them warm, fed, and alive, knowing full well that many of them wouldn't make it past their first few years. It was an exhausting, relentless 24/7 job that offered no breaks, no respite, and no modern conveniences whatsoever. You didn't just have a partner, you had a potential co-parent for a relentless, incredibly risky project. And here's the dark irony. Sex was primarily for procreation, but procreation was also incredibly dangerous and exhausting. It was the fundamental purpose of your existence, the very engine of evolution. Your genes demanded to be passed on. But every successful act of procreation meant an increased chance of maternal death, an increased burden on the tribe's already scarce resources, and the introduction of another incredibly fragile being into a world that wanted to kill it. It was a biological catch-22. Propagate the species, but doing so might just kill you, your partner, or the very child you're trying to bring into the world. Primitive methods of birth control were often ineffective, dangerous, or both. Herbal remedies, prolonged breastfeeding, which did offer some natural contraception, but was far from foolproof, or, tragically, infanticide in times of extreme scarcity. The idea of preventing pregnancy for personal reasons, for career goals, or simply for not wanting kids right now was utterly alien. Your body was a vessel for the species, and it operated on a relentless biological timetable. So the next time you're having a discussion about family planning or simply enjoying the freedom of choice that modern contraception offers, take a moment to be profoundly, deeply grateful. Because for our ancestors, every intimate moment was an act of genetic Russian roulette, often with deadly and exhausting consequences. And that, my friends, is a truly sobering thought. All right, let's fast forward to the twilight years, the golden years of prehistoric love. If you were lucky enough to actually have twilight years, that is, because, and I cannot stress this enough, very, very few people lived to what we would consider old age. And those who did, they weren't enjoying a leisurely retirement cruise or sipping cocktails on a sun-drenched beach. They were often frail, toothless, and barely functional, clinging to existence with a grim tenacity. The romantic notion of growing old together was, for our ancestors, a brief interlude of utter debilitating misery. Imagine living to be, say, 35 or 40 years old in prehistory. You were practically an elder statesman, a wizened sage, a miracle of biological persistence. But your body? It was a wreck. Decades of harsh labor, constant hunger, untreated injuries, and rampant disease had taken their toll. Your teeth would be long gone, ground down by tough roots and gritty meat, or simply fallen out from infection. Your joints would ache perpetually. Your eyesight would be failing. You'd be covered in old scars, chronic aches, and probably a persistent cough. You weren't a distinguished elder. You were a walking, breathing testament to the brutal wear and tear of prehistoric life. So the romantic notion of growing old together wasn't about two spry, silver-haired individuals sharing fond memories. It was more about two decrepit individuals, hunched and shuffling, huddling together for warmth, their bodies ravaged, their minds perhaps clouded by age and constant pain. Your shared bond wasn't built on years of comfortable companionship. It was built on shared trauma, mutual suffering, and the grim understanding that you were both just barely hanging on. Oh, look, my beloved, you still have 3 teeth and can mostly hear me when I shout. And I only cough up blood a few times a day. Isn't our enduring love simply breathtaking? Societal roles for elders were often limited, pragmatic, and heavily dependent on their continued utility. Respect was earned, yes, from those who valued your accumulated knowledge of foraging spots or hunting strategies. But physical contribution was still highly valued, and if you couldn't